it going, folks? David here. Welcome to this week's Griscom Stream, our interactive part of Left Reckoning, where I hang out for a bit and take questions from the chat, talk about a couple of things. Hope you're doing well wherever you are at. Staying warm. Lord, we just dropped 40 degrees here in Texas, and I'm not ready for it, though. Got the house already and things like that, but it's going to be cold as hell. And just giving people a rundown of today's stream. Always happy to take questions from the chat on any topic. We have a bit of a segment that I'm going to do towards the end on the Federal Reserve and Steve Bannon. We have if you would have asked this ask this again in 15 minutes, will be a perfect segue. But Liam says everything will be fine if we get rid of the minimum wage and the Federal Reserve, right? It's like, yeah, that's big time child ideology, libertarianism in general. But there's some quite cynical reasons why they push this stuff. And we'll get into, what the Federal Reserve is and why I think the right knows what it is and pushes these nonsensical claims for a certain reason. But I think a lot of people on the left sometimes get wrapped up in it because they don't really understand what the Federal Reserve is. And I have plenty of criticisms of the Federal Reserve. I think we should democratize it. And there's a lot of things that are wrong with it. But this kind of idea that we're going to eradicate, our form of a central bank in this country is pretty erroneous. But just to be fair to our friend Hermes, who I'm not good at doing Celsius to Fahrenheit conversions, but I didn't say it was 40 degrees. I said it's been a 40-degree drop. I think the low tonight is going to be like 19 degrees. And I know it's a hell of a lot worse in other places, so not trying to complain. Damn, Jacob's in here. When should we do a live show in Alabama, man? I'm ready to do a live show in Bama. I really want to do one in Tennessee soon. We never got to Georgia with TMBS, so definitely want to be able to do that. We definitely want to do a Southern one. We're trying to figure out where we want to do our Texas show. If we want to do it here in Austin or go and visit our friends in Dallas or Houston. I wouldn't mind driving up to Dallas or going down to Houston, but we'll see. We'll see. And thanks so much, Kowalski, with the super chat. Hope that you're getting ready for your Christmas. I'm pretty damn excited. Already started giving away a couple gifts. I don't know. I always feel like I miss the Christmas spirit. Like I always take a little while for me to get ramped up, and I usually get stoked on Christmas the day after it's done. Well, anyways, I want to fuck around for a bit and talk about some right-wing grifters and why they're wrong and why they're stupid. But before we do that, I really wanted to highlight this story that just came out today because this is something that folks are dealing with right here in my part of the world, Austin, Texas. Just listen to this absolutely dystopian story that just came out. This is in KUT, our NPR station. Can your landlord shut off your water to prevent the pipes from bursting? As Austinites brace for a weekend of below freezing temperatures, some renters got a notice that they would also have to go without running water. The company that manages the Croy condominium complex on the west side of the UT Austin campus posted signs saying it would turn off the water from Thursday afternoon until Monday morning to drain the pipes. In an email to KUT, a representative for Pioneer Beck wrote that this was a preemptive measure he recalled in 2021, which damaged pipes in older multifamily buildings, leaving renters without running water for weeks as they waited for repairs. We fear a repeat of 2 years ago. To be cautious and avoid experiencing massive breaks in plumbing, the board of directors for the association determined this is the best course of action. Merry Christmas, y'all. You need to stock up on bottled water and you won't be able to take a shower for the next 3 days. Absolutely brutal and insane, especially in a city that has been dealing with a massive affordability crisis. On top of that, it's not legal. They even note here, is this legal? In short, no. Landlords shutting off water in advance of the freeze. This is actually against the law. the law, said Mincho Jacob, deputy director at Building and Strengthening Tenant Action, said. According to state law, a landlord cannot shut off utilities unless there is an emergency repair or construction. A preemptive measure does not count as an emergency. Your infrastructure is supposed to be able to handle that. If there's a major rainstorm coming, the landlord can't be like, yeah, you can't be in the house because your roof is going to leak. Meisler said the water may not be shut off for the entire 3 days outlined in the posted signs. Instead, he wrote, the company would likely shut off the water only when the temperature is below freezing. Temperatures during the day, Saturday and Sunday, are expected to be in the mid 30s and 40s. So an illegal action, and we don't have a system in this country that is even able to sort of preemptively stop these ghouls from going forward with what is certainly an illegal action. And it would be bad any time of the year, but I think there's something exceptionally cruel about doing that over the Christmas weekend. And as Sune says, why didn't they do maintenance before winter began? I know it's always amazing when you hear folks say things like, well, I remember the winter storm back in 21. Don't want to deal with that again. Well, it's like, well, what the fuck have you been doing for the past year plus? Nothing. But they're very quick and happy to shut off people's water. I mean, it's against the law in Texas. And they do this kind of shit all over the country. Landlords and these companies regularly break the law in the U.S. because they know that they can get away with these things in the short term, and then in the long term, if they do get sued and go to court, they have the ability to sort of protect themselves. And it's a real crisis of democracy if we've decided as a community that we think it should be illegal for landlords to turn off your water preemptively, and the government is sort of incapable, unwilling to act on this. It's a crisis of like humanity, and it's a crisis of democracy. I'm sure if somebody passes, the landlord would be held liable, or there'd be an attempt, but it's sort of like, this is the kind of thing you need to be, to be done before they start doing this kind of shit. It's nasty ass stuff. And on top of it, this isn't going to be an Austin focused show, but on top of it, like, we're already dealing with, as it is getting really cold here, our warming centers. It's been all like, we don't know if we're going to open them or not. And that's critical, especially for a city that has such a large houseless population, to be able to get people into warm places so that they can get through this storm, and we're not finding people dead of exposure on the streets. And I reckon that they probably will open up these warming centers, but you know what the forecast is. You should have a plan and be able to start mobilizing folks and letting people know where they are and how to get there, etc. Long before. It's truly despicable to see people to sort of be left to the elements like this in a country and a state as wealthy as the U.S. and Texas is. And in a place like Austin, which has plenty of fucking money too. Well, let's see. I want to get to this Bannon thing. Let's try something. I usually don't like doing clips before I've seen them, but I just saw this right before we went live. This is Tulsi Gabbard and Dr. Drew. Here we go. Chatting about some of the fundamental problems in our society, and I have not seen this all the way through yet, so we can sort of go through this together. It's been amazing to me, and stuff can be a little cheap, but just to be 100% vindicated on how much of a grifter Tulsi Gabbard was from the get-go, we took this position. And I will still say I'm a little uneasy about I was a little uneasy back in the day, some of the people who were against Tulsi, because it seemed like Tulsi was never somebody who was an anti-imperialist or anti-war, or even somebody who was like really willing to go on the line and fight, for whistleblowers, for exposing the horrors that our government does. She certainly did more than other Congress people, but you could see her commitments were very much more related to her trying to find a stream that she could swim in, right? That she could get some fame in. And I always remind folks that, when it comes to the Bernie Sanders endorsement in 2016, that was a very good move for her. because she was a no-name congresswoman before that. She saw everybody's lining up behind Hillary Clinton. This thing has a little bit of energy. I can do this and use this to sort of skyrocket my political campaign. You saw how quickly, her career, you saw how quickly she sort of walked back many of the kind of key commitments of the Bernie Sanders platform when she ran for president in 2020. And now that she's done, hanging out in Washington, has really exposed herself as a political chameleon. Anyway, here's Drew. I haven't seen this yet. Let's warm up with this before we get to the conversation about the Federal Reserve.
We're facing a spiritual vacuum and challenge in this country, where when you look at the things that are on the headlines every day, when you look at politicians reacting to the headlines by like, hey, well, okay, well, we'll just pass a bill to do this, or we'll just make this statement. I think there was a tragic shooting in New York State a few months back, and the politician's response was, well, we have to ban hate speech because of the shooter, what the shooter was putting out online. I think it was, we just have to ban hate speech. They're not addressing.
I'm sorry, folks. Was that inaudible?
The deeper spiritual problems with a number of these different issues that we're facing, not actually going deep and saying, hey, why are we facing the challenges we're facing as a society, as people? And I think that's much of the problem that we're seeing. I know you deal a lot with addiction and other things, and just assigning like, oh, well, you're addicted to this drug, we'll give you another drug, or we'll slap a Band-Aid on it here, not actually going to what is actually the root cause of your depression or dissatisfaction or unhappiness or this feeling of emptiness in your heart. And as long as our society continues to ignore this erosion of a spiritual foundation in our society, then the more we're going to see these problems continue to morph and perpetuate and ultimately cause this unhappiness and harm and suffering.
Well, there you have it. Tulsi Gabbard going all in on the fact that we have a spiritual rot in this country, very much mimicking some of the nonsense that the evangelical televangelists were pushing in the 1990s. Which again is her roots. And as I've always said with Matt, I'm somebody who definitely believes in redemption. I don't hold people's history, particularly how they grew up or what situations they grew up in, against them, particularly if they're working to change or do something different. But you're seeing Tulsi, who, if you're not familiar with, you should follow and watch. Mike Prisner just put out an incredible report on her, on her upbringing and the weird kind of spiritual community that she comes from. And you have to be very curious when she starts talking about these spiritual values, exactly which one she's talking about, which one she means. I don't know. On Tulsi, I think I've said everything I need to say at this point. She's always been a grifter. I think it's, unfortunate that a lot of people got caught up in that. I think in 2020, she showed her true colors, and it was amazing how long certain groups of people took to be able to see her for who she is. Yeah. All right. I thought there was going to be something juicier in that than her just babbling, but well, I'd be happy. How about this, y'all? I want to do this segment on the Fed, and then after that, we'll do Q&A, if that sounds good to everybody. Because Anastasia sent this to me on Twitter. There was a real meeting of the minds at a TPUSA conference. They had James Lindsay, Steve Bannon, Charlie Kirk, amongst a few others, and of course Tim Pool and his buddies. And the whole thing, I don't suggest watching, but just to give people a flavor of it. The vast majority of it, particularly at the beginning, is all about continuing to stoke the fears around trans people in this country. And some really frightening rhetoric, in all honesty, too, from James Lindsay, who is basically talking about how the media right now is trying to get one of us to overreact, talking about harming somebody. And once somebody does, right, basically saying that it's going to happen, they're going to come after all of us for it, which is just so horrific to hear somebody talking like that, knowing that the rhetoric and the kind of way that you're talking about other human beings is sort of stoking these fires, and trying to sort of preemptively shield yourself by saying, oh, I said they shouldn't do it. but I also told my people to be ready for the vilification that will come after more people are harmed from our really, really nasty rhetoric. So that's the vast majority of this like 2 hour long bit, and they have a few other right wingers on there. But I wanted to highlight this one specific bit. And if you didn't catch it, Matt and I actually played a segment from this in the post game on Tuesday. Patrons can get that, patreon.com/left reckoning, where we talk a little bit about what they were saying about Occupy. But what comes before it, I think, is interesting because it sort of gets to a fundamental misunderstanding, I think, in the popular understanding of what the Federal Reserve is, and it sort of shows how the right wing tries to use this for really nefarious reasons. So why don't I play some of this clip? I might be pausing and restarting throughout it, and I'll keep my eye out on the chat. I'll be happy to put chats up and questions up if they're on topic. Anything else I'll save for later. But this is from this conference that they held, and I tried to trim the segment as much as I could, just so we're very clear. What they're talking about before is, how trans people are goading them into violence, how Elon Musk is defending them right now and how great that is. But that they're worried that Elon Musk is going to lose control of Twitter because the quote unquote administrative state is going to get involved. So that's the preamble. And here's a little bit of this clip.
Well, for sure. You said earlier, Steve, just a minute ago, that the administrative state controls the government, but I wonder where they get their money. The entire government needs money.
The Federal Reserve.
And where does the Federal Reserve get their money?
They hit a thing and create it.
Well, they get it from the Swiss bank, the Bank for International Settlements. It's a Swiss bank.
This guy is actually one of the dumbest motherfuckers out there, and it's pretty amazing when you're on stage with the James Lindsay, Kirk, Tim Pool, and Steve Bannon to be the dumbest guy on stage. And it's exceptional when you're watching Steve Bannon basically having to interrupt him because what he's saying is so wild. But not only is it wild, it's taking away from Steve Bannon's big kind of pseudo-populist point. But let's continue.
Federal Reserves around the world.
Yeah.
And so we're basically...
Is that what that person's name is? Moonlord? I know he's Tim Pool's sidekick.
Run by this global banking cartel at the moment. Not psychologically.
But remember, the Federal Reserve, as the head of the cartel, just hits F9 and creates it, okay? They are putting you... Everybody in this audience under 35 years old is nothing more than a Russian serf. You don't own anything, and you're not going to own anything.
But you'll be happy.
You'll be happy. They give you a little bit of credit, and they put you on the wheel of samsara like a hamster, right? You just spin, and you maybe get a little bit more. But right now, even family formation is later because it's tough. It's tough for a couple even to make it. They've taken, what, $13.5 trillion of net worth out of this economy, out of our middle class and working class in the last 9 months. The Federal Reserve, here's the scam. The Federal Reserve just creates it.
So we're going to get to some of the things about the Federal Reserve in a second, but I wanted people to notice this pivot. And this is why I think particularly for people like Steve Bannon, the kind of general misunderstanding of the Federal Reserve, because it is a complicated system, right? It is a system that is not very intuitive to most folks. So you can come up with a lot of conspiracies around it. I've been very critical of what the Federal Reserve has been doing over the past year, because it absolutely is waging war on everyday working people. And, there's reasons for it, some of them more sinister, some of them that the Federal Reserve actually, while it has immense amounts of power, its ability to do what its supposed function is, which is to sort of regulate the U.S. economy, is a lot weaker than even a Bannon would make it out to be, because functionally what they're able to do is, set interest rates that then have downstream effects on the national economy of the United States and even more largely, the global economy. And I think it's always important to remember, for example, the Volcker shock, when we talk about that and how horrible that was for working class people in America. It also accelerated a global debt crisis because so much debt is held by other countries in US dollar that when you see high interest rates, it creates a really, really difficult position for those countries to be able to pay off their debts. Anyway, notice one thing, though, about Bannon. He's talking about real things that people are experiencing, right? Putting off having a family, not feeling like they have any kind of financial future, not being able to own things. Um, and again, is it capitalist? Is it the fact that you go into a job every day and you produce more than what you walk home in terms of a wage at the end of the day? No, it's this banking cartel, right? And again, the banking system is fucked. The Federal Reserve has tremendous issues, and we'll get into that in just a second. But the libertarians and people like Steve Bannon like to talk about the Federal Reserve because they can then speak to the kind of financial and economic pressure that working people experience in this country without talking about the engine that the system that creates that kind of crisis. And that system is capitalism, right? That system is wage exploitation, right? These kind of fundamental things that socialists and Marxists understand and talk about constantly. They never talk about that, right? And, you know, in their world, if we just got rid of like, you know, central banking, then we would all be living in a freer and more wealthy society, which is absolute bullshit. But anyway, let's let him go on a little bit before I talk a little bit more.
It's not backed by any bonds. They can't sell bonds to Japanese insurance companies or the Chinese. Nobody buys it. They call monetize the debt. That means it's on you are the full faith and credit of the United States. They create it, and the administrative state, they'll take all of it they can get. How do you think we got $31 trillion on the Treasury, $9 trillion on the Fed, another $30 trillion on Social Security and Medicaid, and another contingent liabilities of $100 trillion? Because the administrative state has a funding mechanism. It's called the Federal Reserve. We have to end the Fed. We should not have, if you want freedom from the founding of the country, into the founding of the Federal Reserve, almost the entire 19th century was about populism and the fight over currency and the definition of money and who created it. And they stopped that because they realized the populist movement was starting to get traction with William Jennings Bryan and others, right? After Andrew Jackson. And
so I don't know if you hear Charlie Kirk. I don't know if he was confused or not, but throwing in the Bull Moose Party is a pretty funny thing when you remember that William Jennings Bryan was on the other side towards the end of his career of that movement. Anyway, let's let them finish up.
We got to stop that. Okay, the way they stopped it is the Federal Reserve. We have to take down the administrative state. We have to grab the Federal Reserve by the neck and choke it down. Right now, it's owned by. Do you understand your currency's owned by 31 banks, 31 prime brokers own the Federal Reserve, create it and make money off it, and you live like a pauper? This can't happen. We need a revolution in this country. And this revolution's got to go. This revolution's got to go to the railhead of where the money is. We got to take control of the Federal Reserve and choke down the administrative state. And anybody that's not on that program is nothing more than controlled opposition.
Can we?
Yeah. And as our friend here just on the populist bit, Antonio reminds everybody that the Bull Moose Party was started by Teddy Roosevelt, who hated populists, which is true. Now, yeah, and even on the populist thing, I mean, what he's talking about, the early People's Party and the Populist Party and the Greenback movement, was about fighting about monetary policy in this country. But it was fighting against a system that was prone to crisis, particularly the gold system, and asking to expand silver because there were constant crises of actually deflation in this country, which was really hurting farmers in particular, as well as like normal working class people. So they weren't trying to push for a more limited monetary policy, but rather an expanded one. But leave the history of the populist movement aside for the moment, and let's get to the Federal Reserve, because this has always been the calling card of libertarians, and I even see some, I think, well-meaning people who identify as socialists getting a little bit bamboozled by the system, right? And the point here is not to say the Federal Reserve is good and great. In fact, like, we should be doing something, but it's something very different from what these right wingers push. There's always been wealthy interest in eradicating the Federal Reserve, particular interests. because capitalists have always wanted to be in complete control of the money system. Private money has been a fetish of the right wing, particularly the libertarians. For the libertarians' history as like a cohesive or coherent in the sense of like they have a program, not coherent in the sense their arguments make sense. But even you look back into the 1800s, early 1900s, there have always been capitalists who want to have private money. And in fact, a lot of the arguments around Bitcoin are mirror images to like some of these arguments from wealthy financiers who want to be able to control the monetary supply. Capitalists don't like any kind of public intervention in the monetary system because it puts them all in the same boat, right? Meaning that, you know, if the federal government, if the government is, for example, making more spending and you see some level of inflation, that means in real terms, the amount of money that they keep in their bank account is declining, right? Inflation hurts working people. And I think it's wrong. Sometimes we see people on the left who see that the right is very scared by it, to act like it doesn't have very, very nasty effects on everyday working people. But the way that we deal with inflation in this country does show that, you know, we have a system here that is only interested in one group's interest, in that as the capitalist class, right? That's why you're seeing, you know, these actions from the Federal Reserve, which are to shore up the profits and the ability of capitalist corporations to continue price gouging while waging war on working people, so that your wages go down, so that you become much more complacent, much more likely to accept a bad job, a bad working situation, etc. That's the purpose of the Federal Reserve's actions right now, is to try to discipline labor so that the capitalist class as a whole can maintain its domination. There are certain capitalists who are very hurt by these kind of systems, particularly the people who have been enjoying extremely low interest rates. And that's a lot of Silicon Valley. That's people like Elon Musk. They don't like these activities, not because they care about what's happening to working people in this country, but because they know that the reason that they have been able to absorb so much capital over the past few years has been that they offer higher return rates of return on investment than other more traditional financial investments did. And that's the kind of thing that happens when you have loose monetary policy, is that you have things that are risky that might not really make a lot of sense if you start to look at the nuts and bolts of a company. But because you're not going to make very much money by keeping it in the bank, you're not going to make very much money by investing in the kind of more traditional, safer financial investments, capital is much more likely to sort of flow to these kind of fluttering, new sparkling things. And, you know, Musk is somebody who's benefited greatly from that. Bitcoin has been an example of that, right? So there are sections of the capitalist class that like do not like the end of loose monetary policy. But again, it's not because they care about what that the ending of that system means for working people. It's because they're worried about their ability to continue you know, to pull in as much money as possible. But let's talk a little bit about the Federal Reserve, because, you know, I think it's a really dangerous thing what Bannon is able to do here, because the Federal Reserve can be a very complicated and confusing system. And I think there's a couple things to note here. One, every capitalist economy, and even, you know, socialist Soviet systems have central banking in some form or another, right? And I'm not going to be very worked up about specifying the fact that the Federal Reserve is a different kind of organization. It's not really a central bank in the same way that, you know, the European Central Bank is, right? That's true, but just trying to speak clearly and simply for folks, I'm not going to get sort of bogged down in that kind of thing. Every capitalist economy has a central bank. Why? Because capitalism is a system that falls into crisis. You can set your watch to it. It falls into crisis every 5 years or so, right? Because of the cycle of investment and returns create these moments where, you know, where the system becomes less and less profitable, which creates these massive crises. You know the names for them: recession, depression, crisis, etc. Right? This has been a fundamental aspect of global capitalism. But if you look at the United States tried to set up a central bank in its early days, it was mired with corruption. So the 1800s is the fight in a lot of ways over whether or not we should have a central bank. And in the U.S. case, there was a lot of corruption in that. It made it very unpopular with people. So they basically scrapped it. But without having a central bank, without having a kind of centralized mechanism to deal with these kind of crises, that you can provide capital to banks when they're in a downturn, that you can provide security in the financial system when there's a downturn, it meant that every 10 years or so, the United States would fall into absolute financial crisis. This was a constant ebb and flow of early American history, is financial crisis after financial crisis, highs and lows. And it became very, very clear in the early 20th century that the United States needed to have a system like was being built up in other countries that could be able to mitigate some of the downward effects of the business cycle, right? Which again happens frequently. So in the US, because of the kind of political makeup at this time, we did not create a central bank in the same ways as other countries created central banks. We created this kind of half public, half private system. And this is where all of the kind of conspiracy theorizing goes into. It was because people like JP Morgan did not want the federal government to be in direct control of this system. They got together with other bankers, with other financial powers, to try to push and lobby and create the system that would give them a tremendous amount of influence over our national monetary policy, and while also providing the security that a central bank provides. And to understand this crisis, to understand what a central bank does, you have to understand a little bit about banking. I think most people understand that when you give your money into the bank, it's not sitting in a vault. They take that money and they give it out in the form of a loan, or other kind of financial products to other people. It's not just sitting there. But all banks do need to have a certain amount of cash on reserve, right? And why do you need that? To prevent a run on the bank. Because while the bank doesn't hold all the money that's invested in that bank, just sitting in a vault, if everybody does show up and say, we want our money, then you have what's called a run. And people know that story, I'm sure, from the Great Depression, what that means. When everybody shows up, asks for their money, the bank becomes insolvent. But even away from those kind of like hyper crisis, right? You have to have a certain amount of money in your bank in the United States now at the end of the day. And usually what banks will do, so like if I'm a bank and I'm processing payments, like let's say I'm JP Morgan and I'm taking banks from Wells Fargo or whatever, right? Just using names. At the end of the day, they sort of go through all of the transactions between those banks and they settle up. And they do that basically through a ledger system today. Back in the old days, they actually used to physically move cash at the end of the day. But now they primarily use ledgers and they say, okay, we have this many debits, we have this many credits. This is what our system shows. This is what your system shows. What is our cash on hand at the end of the day? And typically in a normal business day, that's sort of all you need to do is go through your debits and your credits at the end of the day. Sometimes you don't meet that threshold of cash reserves that you need. So what banks would do sometimes is they'll go to another bank and they'll take out a loan from maybe a bigger bank. But what happens when those larger banks don't have enough cash? Well, they go to the Federal Reserve and they take an overnight loan. Typically, that would be paid at the end of the next business day, usually at a kind of higher interest rate than what the official Fed rate is. This system is set up basically to allow the financial system to continue on a day-to-day basis, because some days a bank is going to be lower and some days one bank is going to be higher. And you create something like this so that this kind of normal financial activity doesn't end up destroying the system. Let's say, one day a bank has a massive withdrawal, right? That could happen anytime, right? You have this basically to create security so that some person pulling their money out of the bank or making a large purchase does not sort of dwindle the reserves and cause the bank to become insolvent. This is just like the kind of nuts and bolts reason why you, on a day-to-day basis, want some kind of central bank, something that can create security. The quote, the line on this is a lender of last resort, right? Because the interest rates are higher than you would get on the private market. So this is the kind of day-to-day reason for why you create a central bank system. The reason on the macro level why you create a central bank system is because when you have recession, when you have inflation, when you have these kind of crises, you want to be able to fiddle and mess with the market so that at times when there is a recession, when there's not a lot of people who are willing to take the risk to move money around, and everything is sort of telling them keep the money in the bank, don't move it around, the economy is not sound. The Federal Reserve will try to mess with interest rates by making them low to encourage investment. And the reason that a low interest rate makes it attractive to capitalists to invest their money is because it's just sitting in the bank. It's not making them any money. Capitalists like to make money off of money, right? That's the fundamental of capitalism. So when you push interest rates low enough, it makes it so you are much more willing to maybe take risks to invest and to move money than to just let it sit in your bank account, right? So that's why you create low interest rates. And this is like a very, very quick and dirty understanding of it, right? So that's one tool that the Federal Reserve has. The other tool it has is raising interest rates. And why do you do that? That's what you do when you think that the economy is quote unquote too hot, right? There's too much money moving around. It's making the economy unstable, and it's driving up inflation because the velocity of money is circulating through so many different hands that the value of money as a whole is dropping, right? That's what inflation is. Something costs more money than it did the day before. And that's what happens when more people have money. So what the Federal Reserve does in those situations is it raises the interest rate, which basically cools investment. It cools economic activity because people are saying, I actually want to keep my money somewhere where I can get a nice return on it. And that's what you'll get if you have higher interest rates, right? Versus investing in a company, right? It's much better to just sort of keep it in the bank or to give out a loan than it is to sort of make these investments. That's what the Federal Reserve does, right? And that's the social function of it. And there's a lot of problems with the way that it does it and in whose interest it does it for. But that's fundamentally why you have this kind of system. The U.S. system, again, going back to what I was saying, the way it was created, did create weird incentives because, as people know, the libertarians love pointing this out. It's a private corporation, which is true, which it has a lot of limits, but it is one. It's kind of semi-public, semi-private in the sense that you can't get in on the action of the Federal Reserve, but the banks do. And the banks have a certain amount of profit that they're able to make from Federal Reserve activities, and then the rest goes into the United States Treasury. The Federal Reserve Bank is run by a board of governors, 7 people, and to prevent the United States government from having too much influence over it, it's set up in a system where a governor is appointed and by the president and approved by the Senate every 2 years. Right? The idea is that you don't want one president having control of the system from the capitalist side. So it's a weird system. It developed in particular conditions in the United States. I would much prefer to have just like a straight up government run Federal Reserve, but that's why it's set up in this kind of way, because it was a creation of the banks because they didn't want the they recognized that there's a social utility, there's a financial utility, there's something that the capitalist class needs, right, which is security in the financial system in the United States of America. But they didn't want the federal government to do it on their own. So they created this kind of hybrid system between private and public control, right? So so that's the general setup of the Federal Reserve. And I just went through all that. I hope it wasn't too tedious, because a lot of people, I think, because it is a little confusing, because it seems a little strange, it is rife. It is something that that attracts a lot of conspiracy theories around it. And there is, you don't need these wild stories that there's some kind of woke cabal out there trying to destroy the nation. What you have to understand is that the Federal Reserve, much like other aspects of the United States government, operates with the goal of managing capitalism, because capitalism is a system that is prone to crisis. So you need the government to step in to make sure that the system doesn't collapse every 10 to 15 years, right? But because the government is not interested in, for example, fighting for working people, fundamentally changing the system, it has to create these kind of systems to maintain the long-term interest of the capitalist class. And capitalists don't always win out from U.S. government policy. And I think that sometimes people mistakenly consider the capitalist class to be one that is wholly united. They have a lot of similar interests, but they wage war against each other. They're competing against one another. So sometimes a move that is going to help out the general welfare of the capitalist class in this country might hurt a few, right? And you can see this, and in politics, this is something that is oftentimes utilized to create false conflict, right? So instead of class conflict, trying to get the general public, who are, for the vast majority, are not capitalists in the strict definition, right? It doesn't matter what people believe. I'm talking about what your relationship to labor is, what your relationship to private property is. And the federal government operates with the goal of maintaining a system of wage exploitation, maintaining a system of private property, private ownership, and making sure that that system can continue. So sometimes there will be people who are mad, even in that ruling class. But as a whole, it protects their interests, and that's what the Federal Reserve does. So going back to the Federal Reserve as it exists today, is there a problem with it? Absolutely. Right? Is the problem that we have a central bank kind of system in this country? No. The problem is that we have a central bank system that is not democratically run. It is not something that the public has a lot of influence over. It's something that operates under its own interests, right? And as I was just saying, it's the long-term interest of the capitalist class. So the Federal Reserve has problems. Central banking is not the problem of it, right? You need to have a kind of system that can maintain, as long as we're under capitalism, you need to have a system that can maintain, the financial system through the constant ebbs and flows of a kind of capitalist economy. Now, so that's sort of understanding what it is. What are my criticisms of it, so people can hear me loud and clear? One, it's something that it should be solely run by the U.S. people. It should be something that's run democratically. Remember, Donald Trump got in trouble with a bunch of MSNBC folks because he started trying to pressure the Federal Reserve. I don't know if y'all remember that. And there was all these op-eds and tears on TV. Oh my God, Donald Trump is stepping into the middle of the Federal Reserve. Federal Reserve independence is a cornerstone of the American system and and American democracy. That's bad, right? It's not that Donald Trump wanted to do something good for folks. Donald Trump wanted to continue loose monetary policy because he knew that once that ended, we would enter into a recession. Biden gets elected, and now we see what's happening here. Biden comes up and he says, "What is your policy on inflation?" Well, my policy is that I'm going to let the Federal Reserve do whatever the fuck it wants. That's not good. That's not a democratic system. That's something that we should fundamentally be shifting, and it shows a kind of fundamental weakness of the American system. Look at the Inflation Reduction Act. Right? Climate change is a massive problem, and to deal with it, we need massive amounts of social investment. Right? How do the liberals deal with that? Because they don't have the kind of funding mechanisms that they would need. They don't have the planning ability that they should to be able to deal with this crisis. Well, the Inflation Reduction Act is all about trying to create incentives for private capital to do the things that the government wants it to do, right? Which is insane. It's a waste of resources. It's a huge load on creating, more bureaucracy. But it's also something that is incredibly inefficient when you're looking at a crisis like climate change, right? We need to have massive amounts of social investment, and something like a central bank could provide that kind of funding and financing mechanism. But instead of doing that, they're much more interested in shoring up the profits of a private class of people in the society, right? So there are problems with the Federal Reserve. There are problems with the fact that it's not democratic. There are problems with the entire way that the United States government operates, because basically what the United States government does is try to beg private capitalists to do the will or of the American government, right? And that's an insane way to govern a society. And like this is not as much about the Federal Reserve, but you look at the kind of power that private capital has when you look at state governments in this country. What do state governments do with each other? Well, state governments all across the country are competing with one another. You see that whenever a company wants to move their headquarters somewhere else. All of these state governments and municipal governments are falling over themselves saying, we won't tax you, we won't take any of your money if you please just come here and provide jobs to our community, right? We want more jobs and high paying jobs in communities. We don't need to do that. We should be able to to promote investment in communities that need it, without having to basically beg capitalists and give them a bribe by saying we're not going to tax you. But that's one of the fundamental aspects of American capitalism and American democracy right now. There's a whole portion of our society that's outside of the bounds of politics. And that's dangerous. And it creates a situation where some people are above the law. They are above democracy. So going back to all of this, it's not that the financial system as it exists today represents some kind of crowning achievement of democracy or anything that's good for working people. It's that what the right wing does is it locates something. The Federal Reserve seems to be undemocratic, right? Or doesn't seem to be doing stuff that's in the interest of the people at large. So let's try to push people to support right wingers who want to weaken regulation on capitalists. They want to eradicate workers' protections. They want to eradicate your ability to unionize. They want to eradicate the kind of paths to workers' power that are typical in the current American sense. We'll attach all of those kind of insane anti-working people demands to a kind of story that we're going to point out and note to folks that we have a system that is much more interested in protecting the power and privilege of the elites than looking out for folks. And that's why I think it's so cynical to see the Bannons of the world talk about this kind of thing, because Bannon has no real interest in improving the lives of working people. The Federal Reserve, even in the way that he sets it up, what he wants to create is no central bank, so that people like Bannon. Remember, Bannon was a banker, weren't he? This is somebody who wants to be able to get away with fleecing people. You see what sets up in outside of the kind of current regulatory apparatus when it comes to finance is stuff like FTX. They want to be able to do that on mass scale. That's what the right wants. That's why they push these kind of stories. And again, it's not that the Federal Reserve is great in the sense of its kind of current operation and current goals. But it's also not because it's a central bank that it's a problem. The problem with the Fed is that it doesn't act in the interest of working people, and it's not democratized, right? Those are the problems with it. And because of its limited scope, because it doesn't want to be something that could operate on like a socially useful basis, its tools actually for messing around with the economy are very limited, right? It creates all kinds of unintended consequences, right? They might be able to recognize that it's coming when they do these kind of things, but just being able to mess with interest rates, for example, they know might curb inflation a little bit, but it's also going to create really serious economic crises for certain people, particularly working class people. So I'm going to go and check and see what y'all are saying, questions like that. But I just think it's one of those things. I know it can be a little complicated, but I think it's one of those things that the right is able to get a lot more mileage out of critiquing the Federal Reserve for insane reasons than it should, and it actually has a kind of dangerous undertone to it. And lastly, what do we need? Like, we need a democratized central bank, and we also need to have public financing. But finance should be a public utility. Finance is absolutely critical. Any socialist worth their salt or really wants to talk about doing things needs to recognize that one of the things that we have to be able to take over is the financial instruments of the American system, right? Not just because, we hate the bankers, they're bad, this society's unequal, but because finance is an incredible social tool, right? Capitalists have a lot of influence over our society because of their ability to dictate to governments and to dictate to the society at large. We're going to invest in things that we want to invest, right? And that creates the kind of world that we're living in today. If we want to do things that are different, like, for example, funding a Green New Deal, doing things like a jobs guarantee or federal jobs program, right? We will need to have finance to be able to do that. If you want to just do basic things like infrastructure improvement, you need to be able to have a financial mechanism to be able to fund that. So a clear demand of working class people has to be that we need to be democratizing finance, right? And we need to be taking these things under public control so that we can utilize the incredible financial wealth of this society that we have for socially useful things, instead of for sort of fiddling around the edges so that a few people can make more money. And that's something that I think is an absolutely critical demand about, if anyone is serious about transitioning from the system that we have right now into something different, it has to be public banking, getting finance out of control of private capitalists, and a more democratized central bank in this country. Googsol says, what's the capacity of an elected government to enact real economic policies when the autonomous Federal Reserve will be able to do what it wants? Well, you can say you can threaten it. You can play politics with it, just like the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is something that is very clearly a system that is anti-democratic in its nature. I'm not saying these things are easy. These are just like understanding what it is in front of us. The Federal Reserve is able to operate on its own because it has the political shield of people like Biden who say we can't get involved. The federal government could be playing a lot harder with these folks if they want to, but they don't have the interest to. Threaten to revoke the charter and to replace the Federal Reserve as it currently exists with a publicly controlled central bank, right? Like, these are hardball, right? And you could get a lot more concessions before you even have to get to that place. The thing is, the Federal Reserve, under the current arrangement, is able to do what it wants. But you do politics. That's how you do politics, right? You have to be able to understand that all of these people are afraid of losing their ability to be able to dictate things, and they will give concessions in the short term, and hopefully in the long term we can eradicate their power. But that's the kind of thing that you would need to do. It's the same thing with Bernie Sanders when it comes to a lot of the apparatus of the federal government, even the ones that are supposedly under Democratic control. Bernie Sanders has been around for long enough to be, that he knew that if I get elected, we're going to need to have a movement that's willing to fight and to push and use the social power that working people have, the power that the masses have, against the kind of private and centralized power of the capitalist class and their agents, right? I'm just going through the chat. Feel free to jump into any questions. We always do appreciate super chats. Zane says, Dave, thoughts on James Connolly? He's one of my favorite socialist thinkers. He is one of mine too. And if you want to hear more on that, the very first, I'm just going to pull up the link and I'll put in the chat. The very first, our radical tradition that we did was on James Connolly. We had our friend Paulo Collins from the UK on to talk about James Connolly and a lot of the messages and things that we can learn from today. I just put that in the chat. I highly suggest watching it if you haven't got around to it yet. Sorry, that took me back to the bottom. Alexander says, when was the Fed created? How well did it work in its infancy, or has that evolved over time? I know early 20th century, I think something in the 20s, at least in like its earlier operations, but I'd have to fact check that. I mean, the Federal Reserve has gone through, some significant development, but once it sort of got up and running, um, in its early days, I think it was a bit more subservient than it has become. I think Volcker really changed a lot with the Federal Reserve and its relationship to U.S. society at large and the U.S. government by purposefully creating a recession. I think that was a real turning point in the way that the Federal Reserve operates, and that was acutely felt in the 90s and early 2000s, and certainly even more so now. Jeff says price controls are another tool for addressing inflation. Absolutely. Don says public control. In other words, do you mean nationalization? Yeah, I mean taking these things under democratic public control, nationalize it. You can call it that if you want. Eradicating the current separation between the Federal Reserve and the public. Yeah, understanding that we as a society should have the ability to be able to pressure and influence the one of the most critical aspects of the U.S. economy. I think is something that's important. Um, so yeah, we need to be taking finance under public control as well. Soccer Pizza says, what oversight control does the government have over the Federal Reserve? The oversight that it has is the ability of the president to appoint governors, the board governors to the Federal Reserve, and there's 7. The president's able to do that every 2 years, which the point is that you only get 2 in your term, and that's supposed to be the limit of the federal government's oversight. They're very much in contact. They have meetings and things like that. So it's not like they're just operating in their own room or anything like that. But when it comes to the kind of by the rule book powers that the government has, that's it. And what I'm saying is that you have to make that into a political issue and do politics and weaken that system. And postal banking, as Magaki in the Twitch chat notes, is something that we should certainly be looking at as well. That's a form of public banking. I think that's a really good model. That's something I was really happy when Bernie Sanders was pushing. Also, if I'm missing your question, I'm just sort of going down. I know I've been going for a while. I'll try to stick on as long as I can. Feel free. I won't be upset if you jump in right now. If you have a question I haven't got to, just ask it again, because I might have missed it in the chat. HG says we need to get someone other than Biden in power to get that done, or at least put pressure on those people. Absolutely. Biden's not going to do any of this kind of stuff. This is the kind of thing that, like, if you've been watching me or watching this channel for a long time, what I'm saying is right now is we should have been preparing for a Bernie Sanders movement long before the Bernie Sanders, campaign, right? You can't make the criticism of Bernie or even just general folks for it, because the Bernie Sanders campaign, I think, was such a shock to a lot of people, Bernie Sanders himself included. But I always, say is like, okay, if we are in a moment right now where, one, there's a threat of demobilization, we can't allow that to happen. We need to be building the structures on our level, on like the working class basis, to start preparing ourselves to be able to take power. The thing is that the Bernie Sanders movement, even if it was successful, I don't think was prepared for the fights ahead of it. Doesn't mean it was wrong or incorrect for us to push for it, fight for it. But it's just one of those things that, like, if Bernie Sanders were to have been elected, we would have to been sort of trying to build up apparatuses and organizing working class people, apart from just getting folks to show up to vote. I'm talking about really being able to leverage and organize the working class in this country. It wasn't there then. And I have a feeling it probably would have been a hard thing to develop on the fly after Bernie Sanders presidential election. So right now is the time to start, thinking about these things and building these organizations. Tommy has a good question. through QE, quantitative easing, and open market operations, does the Fed take on system risk for capitalism at the expense of workers? So yes, what the Federal Reserve does is it takes on the risk for the financial system. That's what it does, because it's not something that's is anyone's worried about going insolvent, right? So it's able to absorb bad debts and things of that nature. That's what it does. It basically absorbs the crisis. That's the kind of utility in capitalism. Does it do that at the expense of the workers? I mean, it does it not in working people's favor, in the sense of, like, look at where money goes, look at who benefits from these things most directly. It's not everyday working people. I do think it's really important, though, to recognize that, had the Federal Reserve not taken action, like some people on the right were calling for after 2008, we would have fallen into a straight up depression, right? And this is the thing about central banking, right? You have to be able to understand two things at once: is that the Federal Reserve isn't out there looking out for working people, but its absence, right, not having that kind of um, um, fail-safe in the system, creates a system that's much more desperate for workers, right? A depression would be absolutely devastating to the American working class, right? Because you lose the ability to make money, because investment slows, right? And your ability to sell your labor slows. More people become unemployed, and if you don't have assets, which the vast majority of working people don't, you don't really have anything to live on, right? So even though the Federal Reserve and central banking props up and protects capitalists from the kind of fundamental issues of capitalism, a system without a central bank or a Federal Reserve type system would be much more disastrous to working people. So, um, it's important to recognize the use of having some kind of centralized system to sort of protect capital from its fundamental crises, while also not falling into the mistake that the liberals do and thinking that it's good in and of itself just because it prevents that. Sun Green says because of the founding of the founding of the Federal Reserve, was a meeting at Jekyll Island in Georgia in 1910. Laid the foundations for the Federal Reserve System. Yeah, and as I was saying, if people came in late, this was mainly New York banks who were pushing for this because they were tired of the crises they were sort of going through. Our good friend Nervous Curtains, how are you doing, friend? Says AOC put out a video earlier about 22 things she accomplished this year. She claimed the IRA funded multiple parts of the Green New Deal. My understanding was that it only provided incentives. The vast majority of IRA funding was incentives for private corporations to be able to, through tax and direct subsidies, to basically be able to push the private market. I can't imagine anything further away from a Green New Deal in terms of funding mechanisms than the IRA. The IRA has a complete different theory of change or logic of how to do social investment than a Green New Deal, which was direct public investment to try to build up these kind of things. I still think that what we should be doing is expanding a TVA model on a national level and investing in things like nuclear and things like renewable energy. So yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think that might be trying to chalk up a win. I mean, there are things in the IRA that are better than doing nothing. I don't think it's correct to say that doing nothing is better than the IRA, but the IRA is as far away from a Green New Deal as you could get. And especially, a worry too is like, oh, the climate change investment's been solved. Michael says, historically, to displace this kind of aristocracy, what do you think it takes? I have hope, and I see potential for heroes and heroines here. I mean, what it takes is moving beyond just raising awareness and starting to, I mean, this is a big question, but really taking seriously the question of where are we right now, not just politically, but where it's like the left and what does the left mean? Where is the working class in this country? What's going on? Where are the fissures? Where are the fights? being involved there, and not only just showing up from fight to fight, but actually creating something that's a cohesive, growing, and permanent movement. And that's something that we don't have. You saw some folks come together, around Occupy that was loose. You saw Bernie Sanders stuff, and that was great and really mobilized a lot of folks. But then after the campaigns ended, some attached to the campaign, where did that energy go? Bernie Sanders didn't direct that energy to like a DSA or something like that. So what has to be happening is like doing the long work of understanding what kind of organizations and structures does the working class need to be able to flex its muscle, to be able to understand itself as a class, right? Which we don't have right now in this country. Trying ways to build that up. And you can't just wish for it. This kind of like escapist fantasy that a lot of people had, that one day everyone's just going to wake up and we're going to live in a different country, is just wrong. And it's historically inaccurate. Building the social conditions for real serious change takes a lot of purposeful effort and planning. Leon Byrne in DC says, what politician with a legit chance to win the presidency has the stones to do what you're saying? I don't think we have them. And also, I think that, we need to stop thinking about superstar politicians. We have to be thinking about building a movement. I mean, I think the Bernie Sanders thing really poisoned a lot of people's minds. And to think about politics is like, well, who's the candidate we can rally behind? We need to have movements that are developing and producing political candidates for office. Versus sort of hoping that we can do a top-down thing where some action at the top of society, people running for office like that, mobilize the base. The base needs to be where it starts, and we have to build up from that. It's if you want more on that, Matt and I just put out a Patreon episode on Hall Draper, The Two Souls of Socialism, which is showing the difference between, a lot of times people talk about socialism and the fight is it reform or is it revolution? And Draper, I think, correctly notes that rather than thinking about like that, there's two different forms of socialism. One is top down, where you can create a movement at the top, and that sort of mobilizes and the people, and reverse engineers a social movement, versus one that starts from from the bottom up, right? And I think that that's where we need to be thinking, versus like, oh, what politician can we sort of line up behind? Plenty of people have the kind of the talent in the sense of being able to speak and talk and do things politicians do. What you need is a movement, and we don't have that. Jules, our friend Jules, says, is Cop City a boondoggle? I mean, it's a boondoggle. Or something far darker about to happen. I mean, apart from them arresting those folks and charging with domestic terrorism, I mean, I think it's an incredibly, for people who don't know, we just put out a video this morning on Cop City in Atlanta where they're going to bulldoze over, I think it's like 250 acres of wooded area to build this massive police training facility. People don't want it in the community. There's a lot of pushback against it. City council approves it. A lot of money behind it, and people have been protesting against it, both like just kind of general community-based street protesting, and then some folks who sort of took it to the next level by occupying and living on the site that's set to be torn down, were just arrested last week and charged with domestic terrorism. I mean, apart from all that, I think that it's an incredibly worrying and dark chapter, not just in the sense of people not being able to influence their community and democracy, but the fact that despite that there's so much opposition, not just to that facility, but just to the way that police are funded, it's worrying when you have a state government that's basically trying to outlaw protest, trying to train people how to kill folks, at a facility like that. Friend, I don't know who this is, but I know who you are, Hoss Bossman, but I don't know this channel. But they say Knowledge Fight did a pretty in-depth thing on the Fed when they were covering an episode of InfoWars Ron Paul's brother was on. All right. Let's see. Makagi says, from what I've heard, the Fed can only push up interest rates so far before there's capital flight in the U.S., which would crash everything. I mean, apart from even that, like capital controls is something that has sort of gone away with Bretton Woods, right? Which is sort of the global financial arrangement. And it's something that also any socialist government would need to be able to implement, because what capital controls are basically capitalists saying we are going to rob society of the wealth that is created, and take it abroad if you do things we don't like. And you see those things very acutely, particularly in the Americas, where whenever left-wing government comes into power, capitalists in that country will just take out a lot of capital from that society, and to be able to do the things like higher tax rates, redistribution, you're going to have a mechanism that prevents capitalists from being able to pull out money out of a system. That's another reason that the right hates public money, because they want to have private money so that the public can't control or get involved there. It was one of the things that a lot of people on the left were trying to remind the liberals about, or I guess liberals is my terminology, socialists who say they're socialists, but sometimes act and think more like liberals, about Brexit, which is like to do the kind of more ambitious things that Jeremy Corbyn was pushing. They were going to need to be able to implement the ability to do capital control, something that would be difficult to impossible while in the European Union. Our friend Jay says, Dave, would you say that in your analysis of populism, there are essentially two strands, the American populist movement and then the Chantal Mouffe, which they call the Mouffian variant, that's conventional wisdom? I mean, I think that any kind of modern understanding of populism usually is something that's pretty divorced from the populist movement in the US. I think they like to model and sort of pay homage to that movement, because it is very clearly something that came from the bottom up. But yeah, they're very distinct strands. I would actually say that there's a different populist strand that's separate from like the Chantal Mouffe understanding of politics. I think the Mouffe is most well understood with Podemos. Pablo Iglesias, who's the leader of Podemos, the kind of radical left populist party in Spain, was like a student of Chantal Mouffe. So there's like a direct influence there. But I think that the Mouffe stuff was sort of like, regardless of whether or not people were reading Chantal Mouffe, it was sort of the embodiment of this kind of post-Marxist, post-class politics that I think dominated the left after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So I think I utilize Mouffe sometimes when I talk about that stuff, just because like you can read the text and argue with it. But I think it was certainly, like, that came out of a very particular like cultural and political understanding of society at that time. I think has different variants that aren't all sort of like born out of the work of Chantal Mouffe. But I appreciate the question. Friend Adam asks how I'm doing. I'm pretty chill with the weather. I'm warm inside. Looking forward to Christmas this weekend. All right, y'all. I think I might need to run. Let me make sure if there's any quick ones I might take. JT, what is just the best Christmas movie, Die Hard or Gremlins? I don't know. I'd probably watch Die Hard before I'd watch Gremlins. So between those two, I'm going to have to say that. Donna has a question. Why are banks allowed to invest / divert so much of our deposits? Couldn't that be limited to the point that they could survive a run? Well, that's what the system requires now. Like there's a certain amount of cash reserves that banks have to hold to protect themselves against the run. that there are rules about how much cash on hand you're supposed to have, but weird things happen in the course of a business day, and that's the kind of role of the Federal Reserve on its direct relationship with banks. Um, but to your first question, why are banks allowed to invest such stuff? I mean, that's something that we want. I think when it comes to banking, like the reason that has just like social utility is that it keeps money from just spoiling and sitting around. It's not good for money to just sort of be holed away and pulled out of the economy. You want that to be circulating and being used, right? Because think about it, like you put $10,000 in the bank. God, I've never seen 10 grand in my bank account, but just imagining a nice world where that could happen. You have 10 grand in the bank, it's just sitting there. Versus like 10,000, which I'm not interested in touching for a little while because I just sort of want to, sock it away for a rainy day. Instead of it just sitting there, having that being utilized in a loan to help somebody buy a vehicle so that they can get to work and provide, create more things that are consumed by the society, right? That's a helpful way for that money to be used versus for it to just be sitting somewhere. So even on the left, I mean, this is like operating within our current system, but like, like we don't want there to be a kind of like really tight monetary policy where banks are sort of restricted in their ability to lend. What we want to get away from is the highly speculative shit that they do. A lot of it was criminal, for example, in the 2008 crisis. But when it comes to just general like investment, like there's like on the level of just everyday people, like it's good for us to be able to get a loan, to be able to, to buy something that might be a little bit out of reach, to purchase a home, to do all these things versus money just sort of sitting in a vault. Obviously, like as a socialist, I prefer a more decommodified world. But just under the kind of current constraints, that is the kind of purpose of these systems. And that's why like public banking is something like, there were, that's why like the Black Panthers, a video I cite all the time is Fred Hampton talking about creating a community bank, right? Because Black people in Chicago were sort of cut out of the financial system, so they couldn't get loans to buy a house or to buy a car or even furniture or things like that. And if they were able to get it, they would be at insanely nasty and unpayable rates. So this is where public finance would come into play, and that would be utilizing the ability of the federal government to be able to back that stuff, but it would also be using deposits as well. But instead of the operation as it is now with private banks, where private banks loan out money because their job is to make money off of money, a public banking system could have other concerns in mind, which is like social utility, social need, to be able to sort of divert and plan where money is going in society versus the way that it is now, where it's all just about making as much money as possible. All right, let's see. Strom says Cop City, pigsty. I like that. All right. I might do one or two more. Before I go. So, Soccer Pizza says, isn't the cash on hand requirement a fairly low percentage of the deposits? Yeah, it's if I'm struggling to remember the number off the top of my head, but it's in the neighborhood of 10%, right? But again, it's like that's fine. In the general sense, if you have some security system set up, and yeah. The problem is not that that banks are loaning money out. The problem is that they're loaning money with only one fundamental goal in mind, which is making profit, which is something that public banking eradicates. Because when you're trying to invest in social goods, you might even take a offer a loan out that's a little bit risky, but you're not going to do things like they did in 2008. where they were basically bundling together bad debt so that they could sell as much as it is possible, which was frankly criminal activity. The reason they were doing that wasn't because bankers wanted people to have homes and be happy. It's because they wanted to make money off of that kind of thing. So that's an incredible social power that the financial system has over us, and that's why we want to be taking that into our control. Appreciate the super chat from Tommy, who says, "Don't spend it all on one crypto." I'll try. It might be hard these days. All right, y'all. I'm always happy to chat more about this. As folks know, I'm very available if you send us a message on Patreon, or even to our email or our Twitter and stuff. I try to answer as much as I can. I appreciate all of y'all so much. Have a Merry Christmas to those who celebrate. Happy holidays as well to everyone. And we'll be back, I think, next week, just because Matt and I sort of wanted to have a day in between Christmas and getting back to work. I think we're going to do the main show on Wednesday next week, but we'll have an announcement once we hammer that out. But I'm thinking that's what we're going to be doing. Everyone have a great weekend. Stay warm. Look out for your neighbors, particularly if you're in places that aren't really well equipped for this kind of thing. There's a lot of folks who need it. I appreciate all of y'all so much. And I'll see y'all next week. Oh, wait, this Sunday for patrons, we're going to be having a guest on to talk about Italy and what's been going on there. So you'll want to be able to catch that. We'll put that up on Sunday for patrons at patreon.com/leftreckoning. Come see us in New York City on January 22nd. And anyway, take care, everyone. See you soon.